These men were responsible for the canonizing of the Hebrew Bible, as well as developing the beginnings of the scientific approach to the traditions. This approach was then adopted years later by a group known as the Pushim, the Pharisees, who were spiritual descendants of the men of the Great Assembly. So Ezra, Nehemiah, and his prophets, their job was to restore that which was lost, the Torah being taught again by Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And they took it upon themselves to establish what we know today as the canon of the Old Testament, of the Tanakh, and to develop a scientific process of the following of the commandments, which the Pharisees later took upon themselves. The Great Assembly's most famous work is the development of Judaism's most recited tefillah, the most recited prayer, behind the Shema, of course. And it is known as the Tefillat Amidah, otherwise known as the Shmoneh Esrei, which is the 18 benedictions, or the standing prayer. The men of the Great Assembly were responsible for the development, or at least the foundation, because as the years went along, a couple of prayers were added here and there over the centuries. But the development of the Amidah, the 18 benedictions, which is a staple of modern-day Judaism, which the disciples recited, as did Cornelius, and all God-fearers of the synagogue system at the time, it was part of the development of the men of the Great Assembly. So again, I want to highlight the spirit behind this because it's too easy to dismiss a lot of the traditions which we see as either Pharisaic or rabbinic in nature as somehow dry or legalistic or unspiritual. When you look at the men who were responsible for the developing of these foundations, these are men which we revere as pious, godly prophets of God. Which begs the question, what's the issue at hand? The issue at hand is that kavanah, which we talked about earlier. The kavanat halev, the intent of the heart, the concentration of the heart. The only time that Hebrew prayers are fixed is if there is a wicked or an evil way within us. I really, really yearn to be and to experience what the disciples experienced in the midst of these prayers, and to experience what Cornelius did when he was visited in the midst of these, what are called established and fixed prayers. So you can begin to see the power and the spiritual dynamic of these prayers which we recite. Traditionally, 3 times a day the Amidah is recited, for the Shacharit, for the afternoon mincha, and for the Ma'ariv, the evening service. The Shema being recited in the morning and in the evening. As Patrick stated several weeks ago, elements of Yeshua's disciples' prayer, Our Father who is in heaven, appears to have come from some of the benedictions of the Amidah. We also saw that Messiah's disciples continued with this practice, as did the God-fearers of the time. Shaul would have recited many of these prayers every time he entered into the synagogue before he proclaimed the good news of Yeshua everywhere he went. And in my opinion, they most certainly encompass the quote-unquote traditions that are referred to by Paul on 2 occasions. 2 Thessalonians 2:15. If someone would read that, if someone would be so willing to read 2 Thessalonians 2:15. And also, if someone could open up to 1 Corinthians 11:2. Now, I'm not saying that this prayer is found in those words, but I believe that the language used is very, very interesting given the context. 2 Thessalonians 2:15.
So then, brothers, stand firm and hold to the teachings we passed on to you, whether by word of mouth or by letter.
Thank you. A lot of other translations say these traditions which we have passed down to you, these teachings. 1 Corinthians 11:2.
Now I praise you because you have remembered everything I told you and observed the traditions just the way I passed them on to you.
Thank you, Lord. Very interesting statement. You know, it kind of makes you wonder, what are these traditions that a self-proclaimed Pharisee and one of the most pious students under Gamaliel, the rabbi, what are these traditions that he would pass down? Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? Considering the fact that he had Timothy circumcised, considering the fact that he was in a hurry to get back to Jerusalem for the festivals, that he went out of his way when under interrogation to prove that he was still a Jew, a pious Jew at that, who was under no circumstances trying to dissuade the Jewish people, or anyone abroad for that matter, of doing away with the Torah of Moses. Several times in the book of Acts we see how emphatic he was, even offering sacrifices for the four individuals, that what appears to be kind of the Nazirite vow situation, to go out of his way to prove that yes, he still is this Jew who was operating according to the traditions. Very interesting language that he offers here. So let's look at this prayer. Without further ado, I'd like to begin to, actually before we get there, I want a few facts here. That the Shmona Esrei, don't let the title fool you there, because that is the 18 benedictions. Later, a 19th benediction was added. Now, it's important to note the nature of this. Alex?
Well, I have a question on 2 Thessalonians, and when you look at it from traditions, not teachings, do you think a lot of people, modern interpretations of that are the traditions of Jesus Christ in the New Testament versus what could only have been true then was the traditions of their fathers and their forefathers in terms of, you know, historical Judaism? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was hinting at. I have no doubt of that myself. Again, it's a little bit of a conjecture because we don't know exactly what these teachings and traditions were, but given the context and who Shaul was, regardless of whether or not he was operating in the Gentile sphere, which he often was, I would say it's my understanding that he was continuing the proliferation of many of these traditions and many of these teachings.
Right.
I think when he talks to the Romans, you know, he says, "Man, I'm speaking to those who know Torah." I mean, it's in the book of Yaakov too. Yaakov talks about these congregations which are Jewish and mixed with those who were Gentiles also, emphasizing the same reality. These people knew their scriptures, you know, and they were very aware of the customs and the traditions of the time, for sure. The 19th benediction, although the title has maintained over the centuries the Shmona Esrei, the 19th benediction came along a little bit later as a result of what was seen as people who were heretics. And it was called the Birkat HaMinim. And I didn't write that on here, but it was the Birkat HaMinim was the blessing against the heretics. Now, the 19th benediction was instilled within later Judaism by a man named Shmuel HaKatan, who was Shmuel the Small, a man of small stature, hence the name, who was one of the heads of the anti-Messianic movement of the 130s to 140s after the destruction that took place after the Second Jewish War under Hadrian. And there was an incredible move to establish a modern-day portable Judaism because the temple was in ruins, the people were being thrown out of the land by Hadrian and his Romans. And so a development was taking place. A more local synagogue approach was emphatically taught and developed at Yavne by a man named Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the head of modern-day Judaism. Shmuel HaKatan was sort of his right-hand man. And he created the 19th benediction, which was the Birkat HaMinim, the blessing against the heretics. And this stuck to who? The believers in Messiah. Because it was taught after the establishment of this that the disciples of Messiah were the ones that were keeping us back from doing the Judaism of our forefathers, and they were the heretics that were bringing upon all of us the trauma, the destruction, and the diaspora. They actually blamed the Messianic Jews. And so the blessing of the heretics was recited in every service, 3 times a day in every synagogue. And if you were a Messianic Jew, going to that synagogue, reciting this prayer, you were essentially declaring a curse upon yourself, saying that you are a heretic. Because later words were added that these minim were the notzrim, the followers of the man from Nazareth. Okay? It began as the Birkat HaMinim, but then when they were trying to pinpoint who that was directed to, it was the notzrim, the people of the followers of the one from Nazareth. So as you can imagine what this did,